My name is Chase Lucas, and I did my project over visualizing the environmental impacts of taxi trips in New York City. Urban transportation systems are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, especially in densely populated cities. With the growth of ride-sharing and on-demand mobility, understanding how these systems influence emissions is necessary for evaluating whether they support or challenge sustainability goals. This project uses the open-source programming language and software environment RStudio. It also uses publicly available New York City taxi trip data and the NYC R package to estimate carbon emissions at the trip level. By combining trip distances with a standard emissions conversion factor, this project explores how emissions vary across individual trips and how hourly travel patterns may intensify environmental impact. My research question is, how do estimated CO2 emissions from New York City taxi trips vary by individual trip and time of day, and what patterns are shown when examining hourly travel behaviors? First, yellow taxi trip records from October 2025 were downloaded from the NYC Taxi and Limousine Commission's trip database. It contained data like trip distance, pickup and drop-off timestamps, fare information, and passenger counts. Second, a random sample of 5,000 trips were selected using R. Trips with missing timestamps, negative distance values, or a recorded distance of 0 were filtered out. This was done to ensure validity and reliability of estimates. Third, CO2 emissions were estimated for each trip by multiplying the recorded trip distance by the widely used U.S. gasoline vehicle emissions factor of 0.404 kilograms of CO2 per mile. Fourth, the Lubridate package in R was used to group trips by when they occurred and compared emissions across a full 24-hour cycle. This step allowed the analysis to move beyond individual trip emissions and observe how mobility behavior changes throughout the day. Finally, two main plots were created using the Tidyverse and ggplot2 packages in R. Figure 1 was a distribution analysis and displayed the distribution of estimated emissions per trip, showing how frequently low versus high emission trips occurred across the sample. Figure 2 was a temporal pattern analysis, revealing how emissions fluctuate by time of day, helping identify periods with higher environmental impact such as peak travel hours. For Figure 1, which is the CO2 emissions per trip, the emissions distribution is heavily right-skewed, meaning that most trips release relatively low amounts of CO2. The majority of rides produce under 3 kilograms of emissions. This suggests that short-distance travel makes up the bulk of taxi activity in New York City. However, the presence of a long upper tail indicates that a small portion of trips generated high emissions. This pattern highlights how a minority of long trips can significantly impact overall environmental output, despite most rides having a low carbon footprint. For Figure 2, which is the average CO2 per trip by hour, hourly averages revealed clear variation in emissions. Early morning and late night hours showed the lowest estimated emissions. In contrast, emissions increased during the late afternoon and evening hours. These differences suggest that emissions are shaped not only by trip characteristics, but by broader social and mobility patterns like work schedules and traffic intensity. These findings suggest that environmental impacts from taxi use are not constant throughout the day, but instead follow predictable rhythms. While most trips generated relatively low emissions, a small number of longer rides produced high values. This shows that urban mobility impacts are unevenly distributed across trip types. Emissions tend to increase during evening and late commuting periods, which suggests a connection between travel purpose, distance, and traffic conditions. These findings highlight the value of openly available mobility datasets and reproducible data science tools in helping quantify environmental impacts at different scales.